So a little story to get this started. Maybe you'll see where I'm coming from, and maybe you won't, and I'll just waste your time. When I was in high school, I went to a very liberal school in a very, very liberal part of the country. Two of my teachers were at the original Woodstock in 1969. That's the type of town that I'm talking about, right? One of my teachers at the time had this current events class, or current events type class. I can't remember what it was called my freshman year. And during the later part of the semester, we started looking for what must have been like 2 months at climate change, and only climate change, which is kind of weird for a current events class. It was also called global warming back then. But the culminating paper had a prompt that went something like, what disastrous effects will global warming have on social, economic, political systems, etc., and what needs to be done to mitigate these effects? It was a pretty basic prompt, and it was worth a lot of points for the class. Pretty easy slam dunk. The teacher covered all of what we had to say to get a great grade, and I remember that even with my high A, thinking that, well, if I get like this grade, like it'll put me down at a A minus or a B plus, or and if I get a 0, it'll take me down to a C minus. I'm okay, like I'll pass the class. And the only reason that I remember that is because I got a 0, and I didn't write on the prompt. I completely blew it off. Instead, I wrote about how I saw the effects had been blown out of proportion, or I saw how there was actually evidence to suggest that the effects had been blown out of proportion. Wrong move if I wanted to score well, but my teacher and I were always butting heads, just like I was with a lot of other teachers. And it was a current events type class, so needless to say, like this particular teacher and I didn't agree on the interpretation of many current events. I'm not a conservative now, but I grew up with conservative parents in a conservative state with conservative neighbors and conservative friends. And back then, I was quite the little, neoconservative. So when I moved for high school, it was quite the culture shock. And I was always interested in politics. But I found that I didn't agree with most people I went to school with or the teachers who taught. And couple that with some other personality traits like competitiveness and a love for getting a rise out of people, I started to really enjoy picking political fights, especially with teachers. The problem that I saw was that I was being taught something as fact that I knew not everyone agreed with. Like I said, very conservative household, conservative place. I was familiar with people like, Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and shit like that. But there were no counter arguments that were ever brought up, and since I was always looking outside of the class curriculum that semester for counterpoints and rebuttals, I wasn't going to stop for this, obviously. Global warming, back then, it was just Al Gore. He had just come out with an inconvenient truth. It was supposed to be the inarguable truth. The way it was being presented was objective, and I was told to accept it regardless of what evidence I found. The idea that I had to regurgitate these points rather than question just didn't sit well with me, and it doesn't sit well with me now. So when I wrote the paper, I even sat down with 2 professors at the local college, one of whom just happened to be an adamant opponent of this settled science, and was even nice enough to give me an entire works cited page or folder for all of his points. And honestly, I thought it was a pretty kick-ass paper. But regardless, I got the 0, dive bombed the shit out of my grade, especially for a kid who'd never gotten anything less than an A. And I met with the teacher after class, and we argued for a good 30 to 45 minutes about why I thought that the prompt was presumptive and the evidence I had to the contrary, and how thinking for yourself and questioning authority, something that this teacher always preached, was exactly what I was doing, and that in all honesty, he just seemed like a hypocrite. I ended up getting the score changed, and I still got the A, but I feel like I learned 2 important things. The first is that public schools don't educate, they indoctrinate. That's for another podcast. And the second is that when somebody tells you that you have to think a certain way, their ideas are usually dog shit, or they're purposely misleading you. And I'm not a climate change denier in the least. I believe in the greenhouse gas effect. I believe that man does change his environment. I believe that we should move towards greener alternatives, and that when man destroys his environment, he inevitably destroys himself. What I don't believe, though, is that we know with certainty the effects brought by man on the climate, and I sure as hell don't believe that government is the answer. Greta Thunberg obviously feels differently. It's been a fun time for memes the last few days, but the problem with memes is that you can only make 1 or 2 points in a picture with some words. 1 or 2 points isn't enough when the subject in question is as complex as the environment, mankind, and how you can ensure that the two live in harmony. Another problem is that when people see memes, especially offensive ones, which are the best ones, they usually don't know your background, what you actually believe, or your whole argument. Some memes you don't even agree with, they're just really fucking funny. Regardless, you get lumped in with those who they see fit, and they'll have words put in your mouth for you. And just a good example of that was what happened the last few days. I said I was going to make more podcasts for those reasons, so I guess that this is a pretty decent time to do it. So, on Monday, Greta got in front of the United Nations Climate Action Summit and gave a passionate and emotional speech. I'm going to just read it because it's not that long, and to be honest, I'm not sure how many of you actually listen to it. So I want us all on the same page. Her speech went like so. She goes, "My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean, yet you come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear." Crystal clear, she says. "How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight. You say that you hear us and that you understand the urgency, but no matter how sad and angry I am, you don't want to believe that." I can't take that line fucking seriously. "No matter how sad and angry I am, I don't want to believe that." Oh. Because, continue on, sorry. "Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming, hidden and toxic air pollution, or the effects of equality and climate justice." I don't know what those are. "They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us. We who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature rise, the best odds given by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions. With today's emission levels, the remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable, and you all still are not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you." Sounds like Winston Churchill. "And if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now is where we draw the line. The world is waking up. Change is coming, whether you like it or not. Thank you." So that was the emotional appeal of a teen that gripped most of the world. For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear, she says. Well, fuck, if that's the case, let's look at some of this crystal clear evidence from 30 years ago and travel back to 1989. And I fucking love how much this lines up. In 1989, exactly 30 years of crystal clear science ago, Director of the United Nations Environmental Program, you can't make this shit up, yes, the same United Nations, Noel Brown, relayed a warning to the media that, quote, unless current warming trends are reversed, entire nations will be wiped off the earth by 2000. 2019, no Atlantises. So I guess swing and a miss on that one there, eh, bud? Don't worry though, simple miscalculation. They got the numbers crunched again, changed up the hypothesis, and with surety told the United Nations again that with most conservative scientific estimates, the Earth's temperature will rise 1 to 7 degrees in the next 30 years. 7 being strikingly large because most of what we talk about now today is 0.5 to like 1.5 or even 2. That's like the highest that they really see it going, or they're trying to keep it under that. So we're in 2019, 0.5 degree rise from then to now. So I think that's strike 2 for the UN. Let's see. The executive director of the same UN environmental program stated that by the turn of the century, an environmental catastrophe will witness devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. That's a pretty powerful statement for being made at the height of the Cold War. A nuclear holocaust. Very moving, but obviously very incorrect. It's past 2000 and there hasn't been anything remotely similar to a nuclear holocaust. So strike 3 UN. And as far as I'm concerned, the UN has struck out, but for whatever reason, they're still at the plate. These scientific end time prophecies have always been made and always will be made. But what's concerning is when someone like those people or Senator Gaylord Nelson, YouTube, that's a name, so you can't ban me for that, who is quote unquote the father of Earth Day, can be told by the director of the Smithsonian, another big time science position, that, and this was back in the same 70s, in 25 years, somewhere between 75, he says, quote, in 25 years, somewhere between 75 and 80% of all species of living animals will be extinct. And this Gaylord Nelson, senator, believed him from the Capitol building in D.C., where he votes for legislation. Or this is like when Al Gore, a man who nearly was president of the United States, can stand up in 2006 and tell everyone that there's only 10 years left to the point of no return due to increasing water levels and temperatures. And then, take his private plane to buy an $8 million beachfront home just a few years later with all those water level rising. But whatever, I'm sure he believes what he says. After all, he is just one man. He shouldn't be asked to do his part in something that we aren't. We should just force the rest of us to do it. So these people had political control. And the political control is, we always talk about, is just the means of forcing beliefs on others. The shitty part about political control, too, is that you don't even have to be right. And some of these people held beliefs in things that obviously didn't happen, but with such conviction that they were willing to make the decision for all of humanity. And that's my big problem with all of this, is these bullshit political solutions, the same bullshit political solutions that Greta said were needed and nowhere in sight. And that's the part that I couldn't stop thinking about as I was watching the speech. And of course, I got a little bit angry and then offensive memes started coming out, but it's not the only part that I didn't like, but it's definitely the scariest. And it also seems to be the least talked about because, there's not much scarier than overreaching government. But something that is scarier than overreaching government is overreaching government composed of people who their their like way of thinking is prone to be wrong, but they have convinced enough fanatics with fear tactics to approve of their policies. And how prone to incitement of violence do you think a fanatic can be when it's either their solution, which is more government control, massive global wealth redistribution in the form of carbon credits, things like that, when it's either their solution or the end of the world? And this is what makes me think of this climate activism as more of a religion than any scientific claim, because it seems like rather than God being on their side, they just changed the term and it's settled science. And science that few of them understand outside of talking points that they've been given and regurgitated, and science that I sure as fuck don't claim to understand. A high school paper doesn't make you an expert at all. I know that. But what bothers me is how sure they are of themselves being correct and how willing they are to implement what they're being told, even with the historical track record of scientific end times prophesying that they have. I wasn't the only one to see it this way. A lot of people did. Lots of people most definitely didn't too, but lots of people did. And lots of people on one spectrum, or one side of the spectrum, I guess you could say, agreed, and then another, the other side of the spectrum obviously didn't. Both sides of that spectrum were then represented as one of two in no way overlapping groups. You had the climate change deniers who think that this is all just some hippie hoax brought about by the Californians to destroy Texas's oil, and climate change activists who believe that the world is going into another mass extinction and they can mark the calendar. And that's one hell of a rift. But we all know what happens on social media with every other rift like that is memes. Some of them are smart memes and some stupid memes, some offensive memes, some memes that make a statement and some memes that make you laugh, but offensive memes for laughs from people who find offensive things funny like me and I'm sure a lot of you. And are offensive memes something to base your opinion off of? No. But they are good for a laugh and sometimes getting people thinking when they get angry. And some people, post them to be assholes. Some people simply for laughs, and others to poke fun at people or ideas or events that are considered by some to just be off limits for joking. And you got to admit, you really got to admit too, that of all the people to put on the stage to not make a target of memes, they could have chosen a lot of other people other than a teen girl with autism who gets emotional on stage about something as controversial as climate change. That's kind of a recipe for disaster for offensive memes. It's like the little boy who cried wolf became the girl who cried, mass extinction. So, was the fetal alcohol syndrome meme of any substance? No, it wasn't. Was it funny as hell? Yeah, I fucking thought so. Pissed a lot of people off, but like I said, I find it hard to cry for somebody who wants to control me in some way or use the government to push their agendas. I don't really care if you're, a teenager or if you're a girl or if you have autism. That's just the way it fucking goes. And, are offensive memes mean? Yeah, sure, they definitely are. Are they damaging? Maybe, to an ego, but not physically. And do they get a reaction if people allow them to? Yeah. Are they all you need, though? Fuck no. But what's more disgusting? People making offensive memes or people telling a teenage girl, I'd say, brainwashing a teenage girl to believe that she's inheriting the apocalypse and that everyone is going to die? Or what about pedophistry? Cool little word I learned today, meaning to use children to prop up an argument and make opponents look like assholes. That's pretty fitting for what's going on, at least I think. And what's more potentially damaging? Poking fun at the UN's golden child, who's strictly off limits for memeing, we've found, or allowing the state to make the moves at once. I don't know much about environmental sciences, and maybe it is worse than I think. I do know governments, though, and I'm not going to roll over when the UN gets a girl with autism on stage to act as their brand ambassador for the same product they've been pushing since the 1970s. Nearly 20 years, too, after they thought that the world was going to end in the first place. The point is that all governments need enemies, and it's how they justify their existence. We've kind of moved past this stage of states warring with each other. Not many people buy into it. You can see how, we've tried to push wars with Iran and Syria in the last few years, but people are pretty tired of war. We don't really care about other countries. But man, like, the bigger the enemy, the more control you can definitely get as if you're the state. And if you thought terrorism was a vague enemy, wait until we have something like the war on temperature, like the climate. That's a pretty fucking big enemy. And the size of the budget needed to take down an enemy of that size? Those in power, they probably see it as pretty mouthwatering. You can think I'm an asshole for making fun, but sincerely ask yourselves who the real assholes are. I'm not trying to control anyone at all. I say mean things that probably definitely aren't called for, but my mean words and pictures have no effect other than what they're freely given by other people. But when you use the state, you will have that effect on others, whatever effect you desire if you can get the state to do it. And the effect is not at all as rosy as people believe it is. Don't allow yourself to be manipulated by faces, names, and words, and especially by people who continually fuck up with little to no repercussions, like government.